Hola, muy buenos días. Estamos ya en la última de nuestras conversaciones de Community of the Imagination, de esta comunidad de la imaginación que hemos construido a lo largo de 3 semanas en Under the Volcano. Yo soy Gabriela Damián Mirabete y les doy la bienvenida a esta conclusión de nuestra comunidad de la imaginación. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que formaron parte de ella, que vinieron a estas conversaciones, que hicieron preguntas, que se emocionaron con nuestros ponentes. Y bueno, hoy toca el turno de una charla muy linda, muy esperada, entre nuestra directora del programa, Magda Bogin, y Adam Biles, que es el coordinador de eventos de la legendaria librería Shakespeare and Company de París. Los dejo a Magda y a Adam con esta conversación que será en inglés. Disfrútenla y muchas gracias por formar parte de la comunidad de la imaginación. Community of the Imagination.
Thank you, Gabby. Welcome, Adam. We'll take Mike. There we go. Fantastic. So welcome
Hello.
to everyone. Just really quickly before we begin, please make sure you have your mics turned off unless you are Adam Biles or myself. And we can encourage you to think of questions as we go along. If you personally have questions, we'll be reading them through the chat. So be sure to enter them into the chat as we go. We'll leave some time at the end. I just want to say how really delighted I am that we're able to present, despite all of the intervening obstacles, a talk that's been many months in the planning, and our very first event in collaboration with Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Quite an extraordinary place for those of you who've had the luck to be there, and others can visit virtually, as we do so many places now, by going to their website, and we'll put that up in the chat momentarily for you. So just by way of introduction as we get going, Shakespeare and Company is an English language bookshop in the heart of Paris, literally a stone's throw from Notre Dame across the Seine. And since opening in 1951, so what, you've already hit, my goodness, 70 years, this year?
Yeah.
It's been a meeting place for Anglophone writers and readers and become a truly left bank institution in Paris. From the very beginning, when the bookstore opened back in 1951, writers, artists, and intellectuals, if we can still use that expression, were invited to sleep among the shop's shelves and piles of books on small beds that doubled as benches during the day, and that's an ongoing tradition. Since then, an estimated 30,000 young and young at heart writers and artists have stayed in the bookshop. And the founder of the bookstore, George Whitman, always had a very strong belief in community and living communally as we do, a belief that we share. And he referred to the bookstore as, quote, a socialist utopia masquerading as a bookstore, unquote. He also said that he created the bookstore the way a man might write a novel. Man, of course, in quotes these days, as one might write a novel, quote, building each room like a chapter. And he said, I like people to open the door. And if you've been in there, you will understand this. I like people to open the door the way they open a book that leads into a magic world in their imaginations. Here we are. I should have ended that quote there. It ends with imaginations, and we segue into our own community of the imagination. I think that world and that word are becoming ever more important as we move forward into our age of uncertainty and the unknown. Our guest today, as we've already mentioned, and you should see him on your screen, is Adam Biles, the literary director of Shakespeare and Company, and event coordinator as well, whose interviews, I think, having sat in on several of them and watched others online, in a sense, mirror those linked rooms of the bookstore itself. His interviews lead deeper into the work of each author he invites onto the tiny stage at Shakespeare and Company, which often spills out onto the street.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. I imagine you can all hear me, but just those of you right at the back, just give me a little wave if you can hear me. Okay, okay, thumbs up, thank you. Wow, Champs-Élysées, eat your heart out.
So there you are, a typical intro by Adam at Shakespeare and Company. It's a really small space, and it fills to overflowing, and in the good weather, which fortunately is more than half the year in Paris, there are people sitting out on the street, standing on the street, backed up all the way to the banks of the Seine, literally, to hear his interviews. So I think it's kind of cool that we have him here with us today in our cyber Under the Volcano from Paris in real time in the new virtual, which is our new real, Adam? So a quick introduction to Adam, both in his capacity as literary director at Shakespeare, but also in his own life as a writer. His first novel, Feeding Time, was published by Berger Press in the UK, and in France by Éditions Grasset as Défense de nourrir les vieux. His next book is on the way. And he has interviewed literally hundreds of authors since joining Shakespeare and Company back in 2015. So just in 5 years, because remember, this point a year ago, the bookstore closed. And so we're talking about 5 years of interviews, hundreds of writers, most of whose names you will probably recognize. And they include John Berger, Zadie Smith, Rennie Edo-Lodge, Colson Whitehead, Don DeLillo, Mina Kandasamy, Carlo V. Knausgaard, Jeanette Winterson, and Rachel Cusk. So as we go further into that little opening room of the interviews, I want to ask Adam, since beyond any firm ideology, the socialism we mentioned just before, you said that the real underlying value of the bookstore is hospitality, not just to the writers who come and literally stay there and sleep there, but also to different ideas, different viewpoints, and different voices, including across the whole spectrum here of writers of color, LGBTQ literature, books in translation from other languages and cultures, the underrepresented, even from indie presses. How, first of all, do you choose whom you read and whom you invite to be interviewed? Is there a committee at the bookstore?
No, there's not. It's entirely me, in fact. And in a sense, I'm quite pleased that's the case, because obviously to do a weekly event requires a lot of preparation and requires a lot of engagement on my part. So if there was a committee which kind of handed down books to me and these were writers that I had to invite and had to interview, I think I would find that very challenging. So when I started a little more than 5 years ago, Sylvia Whitman and David Delaunay, who run the bookshop now, were very clear that sort of the program was something that I had more or less a carte blanche to design how I wished. And so obviously there are certain sort of physical constraints and sort of time constraints. So I have to work a lot with publicists at different publishers. I have to work within book tours of authors. So there's a lot of kind of things that go on in the background. So there are a lot of writers who I've tried to get to the bookshop over the years and it hasn't worked out. But broadly, it's basically I follow my nose. In fact, it's a book comes out, I find it interesting. If there's any way I can get the writer there, I will do my best to do so. And it's not just novelists. It's novelists, it's poets, it can be non-fiction, it can be political writers, scientists. I mean, we had the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli a few times at the bookstore, and he's one of the most fascinating guests. So really it's a case of it's a very, very eclectic mix, but it's entirely following my nose and whatever I think interests me and what I hope will interest our audience.
What a fabulous perch you have then.
Honestly, yeah, like I'm sort of, sometimes I sort of look around and think, well, God, I hope nobody notices what an amazing sort of privilege this is and comes to take it away from me, because it's really, it's something which, you know, not only to get a chance to meet these writers, but also to have that very sort of privileged moment when I'm on stage with them, where I can essentially ask them all of the questions I had when reading their book. Because obviously before I was an interviewer and before I was a writer, I was a reader. And I'm sure we all have this when we finish a book, there's so much we would like to ask the author about. And, you know, if you meet an author socially, you might be able to get away with one or two questions, but, you know, it's not done to kind of corner them at dinner or at a party and just kind of bombard them with questions about their work. Whereas I get this kind of 30, 40 minutes with an author that I've invited where I really get the opportunity to ask them whatever I would like to know about their work.
So I'm curious then, as a writer, would you say that there's certain things you read for and that you sort of plug back into your interviews, or there questions that are ones of structure or craft or creative intent and how people compose, or those sorts of things that you read for, particularly in general?
I wouldn't say I necessarily go in with a sort of a preconceived list of what I'm reading for, but I think there are definitely elements of writing which, because of my own work and because of my own reading, interest me more than others. So certainly structure and form, the kind of particularly sort of subversions of the novelistic form, and like the way writers put it to different use in the book. So in your introduction, you mentioned Meena Kandasamy, and her novel, her second novel, When I Hit You, I think is one of the most extraordinary pieces of work, because so it's essentially a work of autofiction, but what she does with autofiction to kind of to undermine the novel form, and to also sort of harness the form of autofiction to make a very kind of very sort of impactful political point is a work of genius. There's this kind of harmony, I guess I'm trying to say, between the form and the content, which is not always the case. Sometimes you'll get a novelist who will play with form and you don't always quite see how that sort of meshes with content. But so that's definitely something I look for. I think also the kind of, and this is going to sound maybe a little bit kind of overly grand, but I can't think of a different way to say it. It's sort of an underlying philosophy as well, because obviously, if you were talking a sort of a work of nonfiction, then sometimes that's very much kind of on the surface. But I think with novelists, when you're reading a novel, you don't necessarily want to be hit over the head with sort of social concerns or the novelist's politics. But if you can find that in the narrative, that can often be a kind of a rich conversational thread, and can also help the audience engage with the work, because we should bear in mind that the majority of people in the audience won't have read the book in advance. So while that, again, for a work of political theory or something like that, that is not necessarily an issue. With a novel, that's sometimes an extra challenge, because like, how do you talk about it and talk around it without giving too much away, without spoiling anything, while at the same time, so having a conversation which is both interesting for the audience and for the writer themselves, hopefully.
Generally with fiction, you seem to ask your writers to read a small section, so maybe that gives the audience a bit of a glimpse, right?
I think it can do, yeah. Not always. It's one thing that is, I try to work with the writers a little bit beforehand to help them choose the piece and to choose the length of the piece as well. Because I think sometimes, and I know this is something I suffer from and something I appreciate when I'm sort of helped with this as well, is that I don't think necessarily writers are the best salespeople for their work in a way. And like, I think maybe sort of there might be an extract which you love and you'd like to read, but is not necessarily going to be the piece which is going to show off the book in the the most kind of accessible light to an audience who are sort of unaware of it. Because again, I should say about our audience, there will be a good proportion who have come specifically to see this writer, and there will also be a good chunk of the audience who have kind of come off the street. They've been passing, they've seen an event is on, they don't know anything about the book, they don't know anything about the writer. And so, yeah, so I do ask them to read something, but it's sort of, yeah, we often work together a little bit in advance just to make sure that that piece is going to kind of feed into the general event as I kind of conceive it.
So in a way, you've tangentially answered this, but I'm just curious whether there are ever books that are coming out and you feel, my God, we should do that. But they're not necessarily books that you love. Could be that you just feel, or do you, some sense of history or responsibility? Do you feel that you're building a sort of live archive as you accrue interviews?
I mean, I think that there's one sort of, let's say, sort of genre or subgenre of books which will always get a huge crowd and will always sell lots of copies, and which is probably the least interesting for me. It generally is kind of books about Paris, actually.
Oh.
And, you know, don't get me wrong, there are some wonderful books about Paris, and I do sometimes do events with authors around those books, but we could do an event around a Parisian book every week, have a packed house, sell all the books, and, you know, from a sort of business point of view, that would be that would probably be more successful than the program that I put on. But Sylvia and David were very clear when I started that that wasn't of particular interest to them. You know, what they wanted was a program that sort of would attract the same kind of writers as I don't know, Foyles in London, or the London Review Bookstore, or you know, sort of the literary festivals, like the most interesting, cutting edge writers around. They wanted them to be at the bookstore, to be visiting the bookstore. So in that respect, I don't feel under a particular obligation. Now, it does sometimes happen where a book comes out, because I don't always get a chance to read the book before I invite the guest. Like, it's rare that I'm not at all familiar with their work, because that can be quite a risk, but sometimes that has to be the case, and sometimes the book doesn't quite live up to your expectations. But I think one thing that helps me, is coming from the perspective of a writer, is that even if I didn't particularly connect with the book, nevertheless, I know what it takes to get to the end of writing a book. Like, I know the hours that they put in. I know that the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes. And so, as I say, even if I didn't have a particular connection with the book, I think there is a kind of a sort of an empathy with the writer and the journey that they've been on that can be brought into play to still make an interesting event.
Well, that being said, have you ever been in the midst of conducting an interview and you sort of feel that you're running out of gas? There's not a lot coming back from the author, and
oh yeah.
Then what do you do? You have.
It depends. I mean, it depends on the guest. It depends on the book. I mean, you've probably noticed, like, most authors today do have quite a sort of professional public persona, and it's something you meet quite rarely, actually. It's a sort of like an author who completely dries up, or even worse, kind of doesn't want to be there. And I think that's one advantage I have. And when I've spoken with colleagues who, for example, interview writers a lot at literary festivals, one problem that they often have, which I don't, is often the writer may not want to be there, or they may not like the writer that they've been paired with, or, you know, they're in a bad mood, or they're hungover or something like that, and they have to kind of wrangle this writer. Whereas one advantage I have is that writers are, you know, they're in, as you described it, in the center of Paris. They're just opposite from Notre Dame. Often they're staying with us because we have a writer's flat. So you know, most writers are on sort of, you know, pretty good behavior when they're with us, which I think, you know, is an advantage which I am conscious of. But it still does happen, because, you know, not all writers are natural performers. I mean, one writer who I interviewed, actually, it was one of the last events that I did in the bookshop before the pandemic shut us down. And I don't think she would mind me talking about this because she has talked about it herself, was Lucy Ellman, so the wonderful novelist who was Booker shortlisted a couple of years ago now for Ducks Newburyport, this extraordinary 1,000-page, one-sentence stream of conscious novel about Trump's America. And Lucy has been very open about the fact that she's a very shy person. She has a disposition which is suited to sitting in a room alone writing books, and has a certain amount of difficulty being out in public and talking in front of people. And one thing that I really appreciated talking with her was, I knew that in advance and was able to sort of prepare for that. And actually, we had a really, really lovely in-depth conversation, because I was able to take the kind of the steps to make sure that she felt comfortable, that she sort of she knew that she was going to be with somebody who had engaged with the book and was going to and wasn't going to try and sort of catch her out or anything like that. And the podcast is available, and I think listeners will really will at once kind of really endear to Lucy, because she's a really interesting, really sweet-natured person, but will also probably notice, it's not necessarily the most free-flowing or the most kind of professional or professionalized interview, which, just to say, is no bad thing, because the interviews for me, which I appreciate the least, I think, is when an author comes with an incredibly polished act, and then you feel like you've got kind of an armor which sometimes you can pierce, sometimes not. And when you can't pierce it, they're the ones that, as an interviewer, I find the least interesting.
Sure. Well, you've mentioned some of the interviews that were your own personal favorites, and those include John Berger, which must have been such a privilege to do. More than once, I believe you interviewed him, right?
No, just the once.
Just once.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that was before I was I had this position, but it was at the bookshop, because I was doing occasional interviews before I took up the role. But yeah, that was an enormous privilege, and one of the most genuinely moving experiences of my life, like being on stage with John Berger, being in that space with John Berger as well. I mean, you described it really well at the beginning, Magda. Like, it's a really intimate space, and I think that's one of some of the sort of the magic of this of the bookshop and the events that take place there, is that you can have someone like John Berger, someone like Zadie Smith, someone like Colson Whitehead, and if it's inside the bookstore, it feels like you're in somebody's salon. So, like, you mentioned the small stage, and the audience are often, right there, and so being in that room with John Berger, and one thing that he did, which is quite rare actually, and something which I try to do and have demonstrated this evening that I don't tend to do, is pause after a question is asked and really think about it. So rather than just kind of panic and answer the first thing that comes into your mind. So I would ask John a question, and then there would be a silence, but it wouldn't be the kind of silence which perhaps could occur in the events that you mentioned earlier, which could be a little bit awkward. But it was the silence of just sitting there watching somebody I believe to be a genius think. And it would last 5, 10, sometimes 15 seconds. And then he would answer, and the answer would be perfectly formed and deeply thought and quite beautiful. And it was, as I say, by the end of it, I was very moved, and there were people in the audience in tears. It was really an extraordinary evening.
Wow, I'm sure I would have been. But I think one of the traits of the interviews of yours that I've seen, either in person or on video, for example, others that you mentioned as favorites, like with Zadie Smith or with Knausgaard, you also saw them thinking. And so I feel that one of the strengths of your interviews is that the audience really gets to see it's almost as if that little intimate space is two people thinking together, because they're really cued into you. And perhaps it comes from realizing that you've actually read their books. This is not some TV appearance where they're waved on and off in 5 minutes or less, and the interviewer has cue cards and has never read them.
Yeah.
Right?
It's funny when I
You've
started
even read people 3 times. I mean, you told Colson Whitehead you read Underground Railroad 3 times.
Yeah.
I've only read.
Well, I interviewed him twice about it, but yeah, I think there's definitely something. When I started the job, I was surprised at the amount of authors who, after the event, would say, "Oh yeah, I really enjoyed that. You could really tell that you'd read the book." And me, sort of coming into it kind of naively, just assuming that's what one did when one interviews somebody, is actually read the book that we're going to be talking about. But from what I understand and have come to understand, is not always the case. I mean, for me, it's not just a case of courtesy. It's also a case of I don't think I could go onto a stage with an author and interview them. I don't think I could wing it in that way. I think I need the sort of intimate connection with their work. I also think one thing that has really helped me and was particularly helpful with Knausgaard was before doing this, I've had many different jobs, but one job that I did for quite a long time was as a teacher of English as a foreign language in France. And one thing you get used to, particularly, the French, for all their qualities, are often quite reticent speakers of a second language, and so you get used to long silences. You get used to sitting in front of somebody, asking them a question, and then having to essentially stare them down while they formulate their response. And so I became very comfortable with silences, with sitting across from somebody and waiting for them to speak. And one thing that I realized when I first started this job was often, and I mentioned earlier, like writers will answer quickly, and when they answer quickly, it will often be the prepared answer, the answer that they've given to 10 different interviewers before, even if the question is not one they've been asked before. They'll find a way to answer the question, how they would like to answer it. And then, I feel a little bit like I'm kind of pulling back the curtain here, and I hope none of my future interviewees are listening, but
I'm sure
if you just let them finish and then just wait, and it doesn't take long. It takes 2, 3, 4 seconds. If I don't immediately jump in and fill that with another question, for the most part, they will fill it themselves. And that second answer you get, the kind of the second run at your question, is often the one where you get the insight, when you get the revelation, where you get the thing that they've never expressed on stage before. And whether I got that out of Knausgaard, I don't know. But one thing that I was told beforehand was that apparently he and Norwegians generally they don't do small talk and are very comfortable with silences. So if you try and indulge in small talk, and if you're ready to kind of jump in at the first second or two of silence, then you're not going to get much out of them. Whereas I think, I was a huge admirer of his work and his project before that interview, and came away from that conversation even more even more convinced and even more sort of impressed by the project at hand. I think in part, and this is perhaps something I don't know if we'll talk about, but because the place he was coming from was so utterly different from where I felt I was coming from, and that's what I found completely intriguing. It's that sort of sense of, I couldn't do what you did. I couldn't sort of expose my life and my family and the people around me in such a sort of uncompromising way for my literature, or at least I don't think I could. I haven't tried yet, but and so that's something that I really appreciate in an interview is when I'm sitting across from somebody whose mind I feel works in a fundamentally different way to my own.
Wow. So I just counted off 3 seconds. I don't know if they created a pregnant silence or not, but that seems like a huge insight. Often translating even into the process of writing, where you sometimes want to just stop and look at what you left and let some blank space come in between, right?
Yeah. In the process of revision as well, I was talking recently, I did an interview with George Saunders about his new book, Swim in the Pond in the Rain, which is essentially his writing course from Syracuse around 7 Russian short stories in book form, which is really, really extraordinary. And one thing he talks about a lot in there is revision. And he has this idea that in revising, we become kind of, the writer becomes a better person on the page than they are in real life. So you could be kind of, he talked about Tolstoy, who was, people often say, well, he was kind of a hypocrite because he had these kind of incredibly beautiful sort of moral system on the page. And then he treated his wife terribly and he kept slaves or whatever, serfs. And like, Saunders is like, he had this idea that kind of, the sort of the process of revision is almost like we're tapping into some sort of like supra intelligence beyond ourselves, which he expresses it much better in the book, but I think it's definitely an interesting idea, and I think it's a little connected to that that idea of leaving the silence and letting see what bubbles up to the top. Oh, Magda, I can't hear you anymore. Have you muted yourself?
Thank you. I turned off the mic. You're absolutely right, because I was typing just to put in the notes for people, the Saunders book.
See, that's the trouble with Zoom, though. You don't know if somebody's leaving a pregnant silence or if their connection has just dropped.
It's just zoomed out, right? Yeah. Well, are there any questions that you would refrain from asking a writer? Questions that you feel you might have in mind, but that might throw them off or in some way be not welcome?
I would avoid a question which I think would throw the writer off. Like, I think there's one thing which I'm very careful about is not to be antagonistic in my interviews. I mean, I'm not a journalist. I'm not there to kind of to investigate or to expose. The conversations they have, I guess they kind of work on 2 levels. One, and these are in no way sort of independent. They work with each other, but there's the kind of the level of the kind of having as interesting a conversation as possible, and also showing the book in the best light as possible, because we are a bookshop. We hope people who are in attendance will buy the book and get it signed and take it away from there and read it. And I think so sort of the idea that that I would try and sort of like trip a writer up doesn't really interest me at all. And I think if you do that, you will immediately put the writer on the defensive, and then the rest of the interview you can forget about it. They're going to close up, and you're not going to get anything from them. I think I try to avoid, wherever possible, bringing in the writers, particularly for novelists, bringing in their biography. And this can sometimes be quite difficult particularly with autofiction. And I remember quite early on, I was interviewing Ben Lerner for 1004, and whereas in his other kind of semi-autobiographical novels, the narrator is called Adam, in 1004 he's called Ben. And I, at the beginning of the interview, I think slip of the tongue, instead of talking about Ben, I talked about you. And he picked me up on it, and quite rightly, not in any sort of unpleasant way, but he just said, let's just be clear, this is a novel, this isn't me. And I think that's something which I always try to bear in mind, is that sort of, however much you know about the novelist's life, however much the book is presented as autofiction, unless they engage with it and present it as essentially, like they're open to the narrator being conflated with themselves, then I'm very careful not to do that. I did a podcast recording with Rob Doyle, the Irish writer, a few weeks ago, and I asked him a similar question because his recent book Threshold has Rob as the narrator and has some, I know Rob a little bit, and there were some scenes which I know took place more or less in his life, and he was actually kind of on the opposite side to Ben Lerner. He was kind of like completely relaxed about it. He said, there are some things in this which are complete fiction. There are some things that happen to me, but I don't have any problem with, people referring to Rob in the book as you when you talk to me. So it's just a case of kind of, I guess, whichever writer you're speaking to, testing the ground in that respect and seeing how they frame the novel and how they're comfortable talking about it, particularly when it involves elements of their personal life.
So you do in some ways don't entirely prepare for each interview, it sounds like. And would you say test that bit of testing the ground and seeing how comfortable your author is? Are you kind of getting a quick readout in the moment, or?
Yeah, I mean, I always, as much as possible, try to spend about half an hour to an hour with the author before we go on stage. And that's not to talk about their books or to prepare the interview. It's just to get to know them a little bit and to I guess to convey to them the sort of that they're hopefully that they feel that they're in good hands and they're not going to be sort of, there's not going to be anything confrontational and antagonistic. On the subject of preparation, I would say what I don't do is write a list of questions. That to me is it works completely against the way I like to conduct interviews, because I don't know what question I want to ask next until I've heard the previous answer, and so I might have a general sense of where the interview may go, sort of themes that I want to cover, but I don't go in with a list of questions. I do, however, really I do go in with quite a few notes. I will, I have kind of flow diagrams of I'll group together quotes from the book and just kind of have sort of areas that I would like to talk about. Although, funnily enough, I don't. I wouldn't feel comfortable going in without them, and yet I actually rarely look at them when I'm on stage. I think of a scene. There's this wonderful documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, called Hearts of Darkness, I think, where this wonderful scene which I think of quite a lot, and I think this applies quite a lot to writing and the practice of art generally. But Francis Ford Coppola is kind of just freaking out because everything is going wrong, and one of the things that's going wrong is that Dennis Hopper is spent off his face on LSD the entire time and hasn't learnt his lines. So Francis Ford Coppola is there complaining to the camera, is this and that, and Dennis hasn't learnt his lines. And Dennis Hopper overhears him, and he comes up, and he's sort of clearly tripping or stoned or something at this point. He says, Francis, man, you told us we could forget our lines. And Coppola says to him, yeah, first you learn them, then you forget them. And I think there's just something for me which is sort of so perfect about that for the way that I go into my interviews, the way that I think craft generally works. There's this idea of absolutely forget the rules, but in order to forget them, you have to know what they were to begin with. That's
almost just too perfect, Adam. I love it.
Well, thank Francis Ford Coppola.
I do have a couple more questions, and then we'll turn it over to other people that are listening. Has anyone ever turned you down? Other people just say, "Oh no."
I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't think so, because I think generally you're not going to get to them in order for them to turn you down. I mean, sometimes, and I love a lot of the publicists I work with, but I try and encourage the publicists to come to the bookshop and to see the bookshop and to experience an event here, because part of the difficulty we sometimes have is we often work with British publishers and British publicists, and they don't quite know how to pitch the event in their budget. They're like, sort of, okay, so I have to send them to Paris. Is that an overseas event, and how does that impact on book sales and all this kind of stuff that you have to kind of negotiate? But so sometimes there can be sort of, I will try through a publicist, and they will sort of, for whatever reason, not convey the invitation to the writer because it doesn't fit in with their vision of the book tour or whatever. And then I'll meet the writer a few years down the line, and they'll be like, yeah, I would have loved to have come for this book. It's a shame you didn't invite me. And I kind of, end up pulling my hair out. But yeah, sort of straight up refusals, I can't think of any. I mean, I know one event which I was really hoping was going to take place and which didn't, which was evoked the night of the Knausgaard event, was that he was just about to publish his Seasons quartet. And I think it was, I'm just looking at them on my shelves, I think it was Autumn. So each one was his writing and a collaboration with an artist. And Autumn was a collaboration with the artist Anselm Kiefer, who lives in France and is often in Paris. And Karl Ove said, well, wouldn't it be great if we could do an event with me and Kiefer? And I'm a huge fan of Kiefer. And that was something which I tried to make happen from every angle. And I don't know what it was that prevented it from happening. I think it was probably whether it was schedules or whether it was will, I'm not sure. But that was one which I really wanted to happen. And and it didn't come to pass. And I guess that ship has sailed now. But yeah, outright refusals, I can't think of any. But that's probably because they don't reach my ears.
Understood. So you must have a wish list that is operative at all times. All this stuff is on your radar. There's writers you're following, writers you just suddenly hear of that sound great. So I imagine that's the case, right? In terms of future programming?
Definitely. I mean, one that a writer that I know, who I know quite well, but I've never yet interviewed, and I can't wait to, because she has a new book out this summer, is Claire Louise Bennett, whose first book, Pond, was published by Fitzcarraldo in the UK, and I'm not sure by the US, but there's kind of a handful of writers. I've met lots of brilliant people, but I'd say only a small handful of people I would qualify as geniuses, and I think she is up there. And she did an event for Pond just after I started, and a different interviewer had been arranged, so I didn't get that opportunity. But now she has this new book coming out, and Checkout 19, which is actually even more extraordinary than Pond. And so she's definitely on the wish list. I mean, there are the kind of the dreamed of events which are never going to happen, like Thomas Pynchon. If he ever showed his face, I'd love it if he could show it in the bookstore. That would be great. But
we'll tell him.
You'll pass it on.
Yeah, definitely.
And then there are a few that sort of which, well, I think of one particularly actually, which I was able to do. Was there's a British writer called Philip Hoare. He writes non-fiction, and he writes particularly a lot about the sea and about whales. And long before I was doing this job, I read his book Leviathan, which is about his relationship both with the sea and with Moby Dick, and it's really, really extraordinary, but was published long before I started in the job. But since then I've done a couple of events with Philip around some of his other books, and then the year before last was Melville's bicentenary, and we suddenly had an excuse, and it also happened to be the 10th anniversary of the publication of this book, so I was delighted at that. Okay, we suddenly have an excuse to do a sort of an event looking back 10 years of this book, a celebration of Melville. And so I was able to invite Philip, and again, that well, like all of our events, it's on the on our podcast, and I think you could probably tell from the interview that I'm in my element there, like finally getting to talk to one of my favorite authors about one of my favorite books.
So we have questions coming along. I'll just ask
Great.
one or two more here. Are you ever at a loss for words?
Yes. Yeah, it doesn't happen often. It probably doesn't happen as much as it should, to be honest, because as I mentioned earlier, like I think one of my negative qualities, one of my weaknesses that I try to work on is that moment of reflection before speaking, rather than just kind of jumping in there and and hoping that what you say is intelligible and intelligent. So, but there have been moments when something a writer has said has stumped me, because it's come not so much because it's kind of shocking or something like that, because it's just come out of the left field. I mean, one example I can think of, and this actually is one, unfortunately it's not on the podcast because the recording got lost, but was with the novelist Nell Zink, who is an extraordinarily interesting mind. She stayed with us a little bit at the bookstore around the time of her reading, and one of my colleagues had a couple of chats with her, and she described she said, oh yeah, she described having a conversation with her as like being in the room with like a moth. And so she said, like, it's kind of the moth, it's like it's in the corner and then suddenly it's in your face and then it's over there. And like that interview with Nell was exhausting, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but so sort of essentially I felt like I was sort of chasing her mind over the stage for the entire duration. And there were a couple of moments where I asked her a question and she would say something, and I just remember that feeling of sort of, I've got nothing. Like I just don't know. I just don't know what to do with that. So yeah, exhausting but enormously gratifying, because again, as I said earlier, that sort of experience of the meeting of a mind which is so fundamentally different to mine is it's one of the most extraordinary experiences.
Interesting. I'm going to start reading out some other people's questions now, because I've had the luxury of my time with you. Alberto Chimal, the Mexican novelist who's on our faculty teaching fiction in Spanish now, says,
Hello,
what's
Alberto.
been the most unexpected answer you've received from an interviewee?
Wow. Off the top of my head, I have difficulty thinking of one. Yeah, I'm sorry, Alberto. I'm gonna have to pass on that. Like I really, because I think one of the things to say is I don't really have expected answers, and that feels like a terrible cop out. And I'm sorry, but like I don't go in with kind of preconceived ideas of how the author is going to respond to my questions, because if I have a sense of what they're going to say, it's not really interesting for me to ask the question, really. But I guess, I mean, I kind of answered it a little bit with Nell Zink. Like she was definitely one of the authors who left me the most stumped. But the actual specific details of her answers, I can't remember. There is another author who I regularly joust with and who I'm very, very fond of. I won't name her because just in case she hears that I'm onto her. But I've realized that she playfully will contradict me throughout the interview, and so sort of anything that any idea that I would express about her work, she would contradict it and then take the conversation off in the direction she wanted. And not at all. Maybe I put my hands up. Maybe all of my interpretations of her work are wrong, but it ended up feeling like a game. And it was only after I realized that this was going on that I sort of adapted my presentational approach. And the last time I interviewed her, because I've interviewed her about 4 times now, about different books, I had a few I said I didn't prepare questions, but I had a few pre-prepared questions, which were essentially compliments of her work. So I wanted to see if the if the compliment would be rejected in order to continue the tradition of contradicting me. And at the very end of our interview, I managed to get her assent. I managed to get her agreement to one of my lavish compliments. So that was satisfying and a lot of fun. But yeah, which is not at all, I know, what Alberto asked, and I'm sorry I've taken it in a completely strange direction. But yeah, it just occurred to me.
Well, this is related actually from Elizabeth Rossner, who's also on our faculty, nonfiction.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Novelist, teaching writing of witness with us right now. And she's asking, what helps you stay most present in the moment of the interview? How do you listen?
It's actually a really good question, because one thing we haven't talked about is there's a part of my job which is also sort of logistical. So there's the whole kind of technical side of the event, which I don't do the setup of. Luckily, I have a colleague who knows that stuff much better than me and manages to get all the kind of AV stuff really down. But there's always a case, the audience are present. Sometimes you can have a disruptive element in the audience. One time we had to abandon an event. It's only happened once. We had to abandon it midway through after an audience member collapsed during the event. Luckily, he was fine in the end, but it was it was, and when that happens in the bookstore, you have to clear the bookstore, because there's no aisles, there's no way to kind of discreetly remove the person. And there's always going to be little distractions. So what I suppose it's the author and it's the quality of the conversation. Like, there are certain authors where I feel, I'm going to make this sound almost like a kind of sort of a love affair in a way, but like you feel it's only you and them in the room. Like, the conversation arrives at a moment where the audience just kind of fade to the background, and it's really sort of the conversation is really a sort of a dance between the two of you. I mean, I think Rachel Cusk, I think, is an author with whom I've interviewed her twice now, and in both times I felt a genuine kind of intellectual connection, I guess. And I mean, be very clear, I think Rachel Cusk is another one of the geniuses that I have met. I'm not in any way saying that we're on an intellectual par, but there has definitely been a kind of a sort of a rapport, let's say an intellectual rapport, which has kept me really sort of focused on the event. When an event is perhaps, for whatever reason, less engaging, I think it's always looking for that question, that point which is going to turn the event around if it's going badly, or if it hasn't really taken flight. Like, sort of revisiting my memory of the book and the notes I made, and just trying to to sort of take apart the puzzle and put it back together, and see if maybe my approach to the book can be kind of altered on the fly in order to sort of to get the conversation to kick into gear. And when that does happen, and it doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's enormously gratifying as well. When it really felt at the start that you're kind of, the mechanism, the gears are really crunching against each other, and then by the end of the hour, it's fluid and it's natural. It's a great feeling.
Well, you have literally in this conversation borne out my sense that for you, there's an art to the interview, and you've just given it to us in a way as you know it when it's happening, that you get to that point where there's something almost intimate, sublime, dance-like, as you've just described, these moments of encounter. You have two admirers who are part of our program from London, so they're tuned in from your side of the pond, Nick and Richard, who are sending these questions jointly. And
hi guys.
They're saying, going through the podcast archive on the Shakespeare and Company website was one of the real joys during lockdown in 2020.
That's very sweet.
And got them to read lots of books that they now love and might not have stumbled across otherwise. So they're asking, do you have any interviews that particularly stand out that you would recommend people go back and listen to? And so why? And I will just piggyback on that question with a sort of follow-up built into that, which is podcast versus video. Any difference for you? Any predilection? Any rationale for one versus the other? And
ones that I think, ones that I would recommend people go back to. I mean, the John Berger podcast for sure. You'll have to trail, but right back down the feed for that one. Meena Kandasamy, who I mentioned earlier, was a really, really extraordinary guest. Rachel Cusk, certainly worth checking out. Knausgaard, definitely. I'm trying to think. Olivia Lang is a writer I really admire. The podcast I did with her, or the event I did with her, which is on the podcast for her book, The Lonely City. I think it's one of the few that when I listen back to it, I almost lost control of myself because I just admired her so much, and I admired the book, and I think the book had connected with me in certain ways that just made it's a very, very special experience. Renée Edo-Lodge, who you mentioned in the introduction, her book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race is extraordinary. It was an extraordinary book, and it was a deeply personal and very, very interesting event. Very, very worth checking out. I'm trying to think of some others. I mean, the Don DeLillo event was just sort of, so it was quite last minute and quite unexpected, and so sort of I knew his work a little bit, but I had to immerse myself in his work because it wasn't for a new event, and so for a new book, because it was about 6 months before Zero K came out, and so I basically spent a few weeks reading his backlist, and then ironically, actually, he decided to read from one of the few books that I hadn't read, which was Falling Man, his book about the 9/11 attacks. But that was fine. But just, there's a sort of a towering figure of literature that was quite something. Concerning your question, Magda, about like podcasts and video and things like that, that's something I'm reckoning with at the moment, because when lockdown started and basically most bookshops kind of moved their programs online, it was kind of well timed for us, because I'd actually didn't have a program because we were going to have building works in the bookstore from mid-February until mid-September. So I actually had nothing planned. And because, we weren't able to get to the shop and things like that, and I didn't have the equipment, we decided, okay, we may do podcasts in the future, but we will, we'll take a back seat at the moment. We'll let people sort of breathe, discover our backlist. But now in the last few months, the frustration has kicked in. There's all these brilliant books coming out, brilliant books that we want to promote, because obviously bringing a book out during COVID has been hell for a lot of writers. And so tomorrow, the podcast will launch again. So I have been recording some interviews. I've done about 6 so far, and I've got a few more planned in the coming weeks. And I've been doing it all online. And I was quite reluctant because I thought it would be cold. I wasn't sure how well it would work. But actually, I've been quite struck by how pleasant it is, actually. Maybe partly because it's one of the few conversations you have without a mask at the moment, so you can see the face and you can really engage with the person. But yeah, I've got some wonderful talks coming up. The first one is with Jenny Fagan and Selena Godin, there's Rachel Kushner, there's Rob Doyle, there's Hari Kanzru. There's a wonderful Turkish journalist called Ece Temelkaran who wrote a book a few years ago called How to Lose a Country, about the kind of descent into authoritarian rule. And her new book Together is essentially what to do when you're there, kind of thing. And it's really, really wonderful. And the conversation, which I think will be published in about 2 weeks' time, considering it was mediated through the screen, was one of it was a really, really sort of deeply felt and I think really interesting discussion. So so I'm kind of sold. Like, I think when things start up again, I think I will. Obviously, we'll have events in the bookstore because I miss them like mad. But I think perhaps when authors can't get to the bookstore for whatever reason, and I want to talk with them about the book, we'll maybe continue doing some remote interviews as well.
Well, this is music to our ears. Will you share that list with us? Could we then share it with our whole group of
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's
alumni. We would love to have the list of upcoming podcasts.
Yeah. I'll how shall I email it to you? And
you email it to me. I'll throw it into a group email. Yep.
Wonderful. Yeah, with pleasure.
Well, I think you've come full circle and you've embodied right to the very end our hope that the virtual would also be real for us. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, I hope I've covered the questions that came through. Many thanks are also coming through, and we'll share them with you, Adam.
Thank you, everyone.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye. Adiós. Buenas noches.